I suppose my first question is, I mean, it's hardly your standard concert piece. So I wonder if you could just give us sort of background on how you approach writing for Nevis, how you approached writing for the piece, writing the piece itself, and so on.
I guess at the time I was thinking particularly about the power that music can have to bring people together to form communities. And I guess in the broader sense, you have the idea that people, some people might like the same music or dislike the same music, so kind of broad community in that sense. But also I was interested in the way that the acts of listening and creating could also form communities despite maybe physical distances between listeners and creators. Um, and so in that way, I was kind of toying with this, I guess, kind of cyclical idea whereby what if we had a little bit of music that the listeners were then asked to draw as a kind of graphic score or to kind of interpret however they want to interpret. And then what if that graphic score or that interpretation could then stimulate more music? So you have this kind of never-ending cycle of drawings and sounds. And so that was kind of the core idea, which I thought might be able to kind of present the idea of listeners as being also creators fairly well.
Marcus, how did you find it different to, well, the normal sort of playing that you and we do in Nevis Ensemble?
The difference mainly I find between the graphic score and like a traditional piece, like traditional written down bit of music, is your own experiences and your own sort of feelings at that moment can just shine through whatever you want to put out there. You can, and you've just got the graphic score in front of you to influence whatever you're going to do to make what sound you're going to make.
Marcus has just said, as a player, you can do whatever you like in your piece. Is that how do you feel about that, Alex?
I guess I've had the privilege to hear the ways in which Marcus has interpreted these graphic scores. So I can tell you that I have no qualms about that personally. So thank you, Marcus, and indeed all the other players. No, but I mean, broadly, it's not something which I'm particularly concerned about. I guess, especially at the time of constructing or curating this piece, I was having quite a few conversations with artists who come from outside the Western classical music space, and so particularly people who come from a kind of traditional Chinese music education, and I mean kind of traditional Chinese music in terms of the genre. And in that kind of music, the idea of the composer and the performer being separate people is not a very common thing. So the kind of people who would write the music are the performers, and obviously improvisation plays a large part in that as well. And I know lots of other musical cultures have this ingrained, and so maybe it's actually classical music, Western classical music, that has that anomalous vibe of composer as being separate.
Marcus, is it really as simple as you just play whatever you like? I mean, or are you actually playing? To what extent are you playing with the other people in the orchestra?
Well, I think it's a lot about using your ears as well as your eyes to see what's in front of you. If the person beside you is playing as loud as possible and like lots of staccato semiquavers, for instance, playing something that bounces off of that is a nice idea. And if you can work that thing out with something that's also on the page in front of you from the visual score, it's just combining everything around you to further extend the life of the piece into something new.
There is, of course, a second ensemble playing with John conducting at the other end of the room, and that is very fixed and has a very specific shape throughout the architecture of the piece. So we had us sort of freewheeling at one end of the room and this very formalized, structured thing happening at the other end. And I remember we had to talk about volume of what we were doing in the improvisation circle of we can't obliterate them, they have to be connected somehow. And yet we are a different texture and a different energy.
I guess in my mind that was one of the practical solutions. in the sense that I was again just trying to curate that framework where you have a beginning of the piece and you have an end of the piece. And so in order to end the piece, I thought it might be facilitated most easily, by half of the ensemble kind of finishing their music, and hopefully what you'll see in the recording is a fairly natural and organic end.
It felt it in the room, you could, because it bubbles up to quite a cacophony, and then it really, you do feel your heart rate slowing. Breathing is a central part of it as well. So by the end, people will see the piece is still going on, but there are no notes being played, but it's still an extraordinary communal experience, including, and we've not mentioned the other crucial piece of the puzzle of the piece, which is the other part of the audience who were upstairs in the church writing. What did you want them to be doing, Alex, and what's their part in the piece?
That was to do with, I guess, imagination. I asked them to imagine stories that responded to what they heard in real time. So they're kind of responding not only to notated music, but also to the imagined music that the players like Marcus were imagining and conceiving. And so that's exactly what I would love online audiences to do, to touch on this briefly, which is to take a piece of paper and kind of respond to what you hear. So you can perhaps draw some kind of drawing that responds to what you hear, or you can write a story, and that corresponds to what those audiences at the top were doing at the time.
Well, Olivia, we haven't talked to you yet. I wonder if you could talk to us about what the proportion was in your activity, whether you were drawing what you were hearing or drawing with a view to this is the sound I want you to play.
So I found it, first of all, extremely exciting to be given the opportunity to draw what I hear. Because when I play, I imagine stories, a bit like when you're reading. So you get visuals of when you're reading a book, and that's what I get when I play music. So it's quite exciting to be allowed to put what I see onto paper and then see what someone else interprets from what I'm writing or what I'm drawing. So I found it, I loved it. So first, when we just hear the piece, it's the air and the breathing. And it was quite exciting to be able to try and imagine what I see and try and put it on paper, because some of the sounds that I hear are not just pictures, but also texture. One of the first places that Nevis went was on top of Ben Nevis. So there was a lot of wind and it was freezing, and you could hear the rocks breaking a little bit and cracking around you while you were walking. So one of the sounds I heard was the rocks. So what I did was I scrumpled up paper and then ripped pieces of paper, because that's what I saw. It was quite exciting. It was very nice to be told, oh, you can be part of the creating process, because I'm used to being on the end of being given the piece of paper so that I can play.
Would you now, if you were asked to play a graphic score, would you do it differently, having created one? Would you think differently about it?
Yes, I think so. When I was doing some of the scoring, some of the drawings and some of the crumpling of the paper, I would imagine what I would play as an oboe player. So I was imagining some of the keys and what I could do with the reed, and what you can do with just blowing the air in the instrument without making sounds. So yeah, it would be quite exciting for me to be able to get some of the some of the paper that we did, and then just see what I would interpret, but for myself.
Thanks, Olivia. I'd like to ask Marcus, actually, are there any scores that stick out in your memory that were either difficult or, oh, it's obvious what I'll do with that one from the piece?
There was a few that when they got placed on the stand in front of me just made me laugh. Like a horse, fire engine. I think someone drew a boat, and just when you're going from abstract shapes into, oh, this is quite clearly like a boat. It's just something that really stuck out. But sometimes it was the ones that were clearly depicting something that were the hardest to work with. Mainly because like you'd have an initial thought of, oh, this is the sound, and then that's it. And you can't really develop on it anymore. Whereas with the more abstract ones, it's more of a jumping off point. Everything sort of relates to something else on the page, and you need to work from that to get to the other side of the score, so to speak.
Olivia, I mean, conversely, did you kind of take different approaches to try and elicit different responses from the players who were playing your scores?
I would change depending on what was happening in the improvisers. So I tried, when I would hear, I was like looking around the room, what were the instruments that were there? So what instruments were improvising? Was it winds? Was it just strings? So I was looking at everyone and trying to make different like how do you say, different like pictures and shapes depending on what I think could go well with what instrument, and hope that whoever got it would be like, oh yeah, that is supposed to be windy sounding. So maybe I could do a wee bit of a windy sounding thing with my string instrument. Don't know how they can do that, but they're magic. So I'm sure they figured out a way.
I would have just turned to Alex really and say, you know, what we've heard from Olivia and Marcus, and they've articulated so well, is just how free they were. But there is this sort of, okay, conversation going on, both figuratively and literally when you're rehearsing, between what is specified and what isn't. And of course, Alex, as the ultimate architect, or equally as the ultimate liberator, I just wonder, how did you approach that sort of freedom control dynamic in the whole thing?
I love the idea of the conversations that were happening between the drawers and the players. In some ways, it kind of resonates in a way that I couldn't have, or I didn't imagine when I was constructing the piece, to kind of reflect what being in a community is like, where you are talking to people and like sometimes you communicate in a different way. Sometimes people misinterpret, sometimes they interpret very well. And so I love the kind of social relationships that would kind of seem to come out fairly organically from that process. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the control and freedom, I think it's something to me which is always innate in any kind of composition process, because in my mind, like the music doesn't exist until it's performed, because music is a sonic experience. And so once I've written notes on a manuscript, that doesn't mean that the piece exists at that moment. It only really exists when I hear it. And 99% of the time, I'm not the one creating the sound. And so that sense of collaboration, I think, is something which I have tried to make more apparent in kind of the pieces that I write. And obviously with this one, it's something which I hope to make super apparent. So I guess really embracing the freedom control, not just from me, but also the freedom and control which performers have responsibility for, is also something which I'm really interested in.
Well, certainly you achieved, certainly in our performance, I think I can see Marcus and Olivia agreeing that, you know, you achieved this sense of togetherness and this sense of community. It was really there in the art, and both in the process and the product of the whole thing. And for people watching the video, there is actually a web page on the Nevis website. The link will be in the comments the comments below, where you can actually see various of the scores that the audience orchestra members made, and think about how you would react to those. And as Alex says, please do feel free to react or respond artistically to the video itself. But in the meantime, I guess we should hand over to YouTube and the premiere of Alex Ho's Breathe and Draw. Thank you very much all for a wonderful discussion, and everybody enjoy the premiere.